I'm Susie McCaster, 54, and I'm one of the few women in the history of the United States Army to wear 3 stars. For 36 years, I let the work speak for itself. Missing holidays and funerals to run operations my own family was never cleared to know about, while they decided I had run off to play soldier and made nothing of myself. But the morning a captain blocked me at the door of my own Situation Room and told me I was on the wrong floor, 4 words from a 2-star general changed the way I would carry that wound for the rest of my life. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who decided who you were before they knew a single true thing about you? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand quietly in your own worth while someone underestimated you to your face, hit that like button and subscribe. The autumn I turned 18, my father drove my brother 3 hours to tour a college campus and could not find the 20 minutes it would have taken to drive me to the bus that carried me to basic training. I have thought about that drive more times than I can count. Not because it surprised me, because it did not. In our house, achievement had a gender, and it was not mine. My brother Wesley was 4 years younger than me, and from the day he was born, he was the future. I was the one who could fix the lawnmower, balance the checkbook, and talk our grandmother down from one of her moods, and none of that ever made it into a single dinner conversation. Wesley brought home a debate trophy when he was 12, and my father, Howard, propped it on the mantel like a relic. I brought home a report card with the highest marks in my class, and he told me it was nice, then asked Wesley how the debate team was looking for next season. My mother, Lorraine, was not cruel. She was just quiet in the places where it counted. When my father decided something about who his children were, she studied her plate and let it stand. I learned early that silence in a house can be its own kind of weather. You feel it on your skin even when no one says a word. I want to be clear about something because it matters for everything that came later. I did not enlist to spite my father. I enlisted because the first time a recruiter laid out what the Army actually asked of a person, discipline, competence, the willingness to be measured by what you could do rather than who your parents wished you were. Something in me went still and certain. For the first time in my life, there was a place where the rules were the same for everybody, and the scoreboard was honest. I wanted in. I told my family at dinner in the spring of 1990. I had the enlistment paperwork folded in my back pocket. I waited until my father had finished his coffee, and then I said it plainly. I had joined the Army, and I was leaving in the fall. My father set down his fork. He did not yell. That was never his way. He looked at me the way you look at a decision someone else has made badly and said, "So you're running off to play soldier instead of making something of yourself." Then he picked his fork back up. Wesley, 14 and already fluent in our father's opinions, smirked into his glass. My mother asked if anyone wanted more potatoes. That was the whole conversation. 8 months of my life turning a corner, and it earned 1 sentence and a request about potatoes. The morning I left, I carried 1 duffel bag down to the end of the driveway. Wesley waved from the porch in his pajamas, half asleep, more out of habit than affection. My parents did not come outside. I stood at the end of the driveway in the gray light with the bag at my feet and waited for the bus. And when it came, I got on it without looking back, because I had already learned that looking back at that house only ever cost me something. I was not angry. I want you to understand that. I was something quieter than angry. I was free. Basic training is designed to break people down so it can build them back up. And I have watched it crush soldiers who had spent 18 years being told they were wonderful. It did not crush me. I had spent 18 years being told I was ordinary, so the only direction left to go was up. When a drill sergeant screamed in my face that I was nothing, I already knew how to stand still inside that and keep working. I had been training for it at the dinner table my whole life. There is a memory I keep from before all of it, from when I was 15. Our family car died in the driveway on a winter morning, and my father stood over the open hood, looking at it like it had personally betrayed him. I had read the manual cover to cover the month before, the way other kids read magazines. I told him it was probably the alternator. He waved me off. He called a mechanic down the road who came out, looked under the hood for 10 minutes, and told him it was the alternator. My father paid the man, thanked him, and for years afterward told the story of how the mechanic down the road had saved us that winter. I was standing right there. I had said the word first. It never occurred to him that the answer had already been in his own kitchen, wearing his own last name. I did not tell that story to make my father a villain. He was not a villain. He was a man who had decided very early what shape his children were allowed to take. And he was not curious enough about either of us to check whether the shapes were true. Wesley got the shape of the prince. I got the shape of the disappointment who was good with her hands. The tragedy of it, if it is a tragedy, is that he genuinely believed he was being fair. By the end of basic, I was the one other recruits came to when they could not figure something out. I was the one the instructors used as an example. I stood at attention for the first time in a uniform that had been issued to me by an institution that did not know my father's name and did not care. And I felt the strangest thing settle over me. It felt like being seen, not praised, just seen accurately for what I could actually do. I did not know yet that it would take 36 years and a stranger in a hallway to give me that feeling in front of the people whose blood I shared. I did not know I would spend most of my adult life letting the work speak and watching my family refuse to hear it. All I knew, standing in formation at 19 years old, was that I had finally found the one place on earth where the only question anyone asked me was whether I could do the job. The answer, it turned out, was yes. Again and again, for the rest of my life, the answer was yes. The first person who ever asked me where I learned to think was a captain named Frank Delacroix, and he asked it in a supply tent in the desert in the spring of 1991. I was 19 and a private first class, deployed in support of the Gulf War, doing work that was supposed to be invisible. The pipeline that moved parts and intelligence summaries between 3 units had broken down into chaos, the kind of bureaucratic snarl that gets people killed slowly because the right thing arrives in the wrong place a day too late. Nobody had asked me to fix it. I fixed it anyway, overnight, because I could not stand to watch a broken system stay broken when the logic of the fix was sitting right there in front of everyone. Captain Delacroix came in the next morning, looked at the rebuilt boards, traced the new flow with one finger, and turned to me. He did not ask who authorized it. He asked, "Where did you learn to think like that?" I did not have an answer. The truth was that I had always thought like that. The difference was that for the first time in my life, someone had noticed and decided it was worth a question instead of a shrug. I told him I had just looked at where things were getting stuck. He nodded slowly, the way a person does when they are filing something away, and from that morning forward, he watched me. That is the thing nobody tells you about being overlooked your whole childhood. When someone finally sees you clearly, it does not feel like flattery. It feels like oxygen. I would have followed Frank Delacroix into anything. Not because he praised me, he rarely did, but because he looked at me and saw an officer where my own father saw a runaway. I wrote letters home in those years. I want to be honest about how naive I was, because the naivety is part of the story. I kept thinking that if I just achieved enough, the achievements would eventually be loud enough to reach across the distance. I wrote home when I was meritoriously promoted in 1992. I told my mother on the phone, carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid of dropping. There was a pause, and then she told me that Wesley had been accepted to law school. The promotion never came up again. Not that call, not the next one, not ever. It simply dissolved into the air the way everything about me dissolved in that family, while every milestone of my brother's was carved into stone. I stopped writing the achievements down after a while. I would call home and ask about everyone else and say that work was fine, and when my mother asked, as she always did, when I was going to get a real job, I would tell her soon, "Mom, soon," and change the subject. It was easier than the alternative. The alternative was explaining again to people who had already decided not to understand. In 1996, I was commissioned through Officer Candidate School. I was 24 years old. The Army reserved seats at those graduations for family, and I had told my parents the date months in advance. I had even told them, in a moment of weakness I am not proud of, that it would mean a great deal to me if they came. The seats stayed empty. But Frank Delacroix, by then a major, drove 4 hours to be there. He stood in for the family that did not come, and he pinned the gold bars of a second lieutenant onto my collar with hands that had pinned a lot of bars onto a lot of collars. When he was done, he stepped back, looked at me, and said something I have carried for 30 years. He said, "Family's not always blood. Sometimes it's the people who show up." I held myself together through the ceremony and fell apart for about 90 seconds in a stairwell afterward, alone. And then I put myself back together and went to the reception and shook hands and started my career as an officer. I have never told anyone about the stairwell until now. There did not seem to be a point. The lesson had already landed. The people who show up are your family. The people who share your name are sometimes just the people who share your name. The other thing that defined those years was the silence I learned to keep about the work itself. As I moved into compartmented spaces, into the parts of the Army that do not get talked about at dinner parties, I learned to say a particular sentence with a flat, pleasant face. I can't talk about work. I said it to friends, to dates, eventually to my own family. And here's the cruel mechanics of it. My family heard that sentence and concluded that I had nothing worth talking about. They could not imagine that the silence covered something rather than nothing. In their minds, a person who could not describe their job did not have an impressive one. They never once considered the opposite, that the job might be so far beyond their picture of me that the country itself required me to keep quiet about it. So the gap widened. Every year I rose, and every year I got quieter about it, and every year my family filled the silence with the story they already believed. She does some kind of desk thing in the Army. She never really made anything of herself. Poor Susie still hasn't settled down. Meanwhile, Wesley was making partner and buying the house and standing exactly where my father had always known he would stand, in the bright center of the family's pride. I made my peace with it, or I told myself I did. I had Frank, I had the work, I had a self-respect that I had built from the studs up, alone, in a family that gave me no materials to build it with. That should have been enough. For long stretches it was enough. But there is a particular kind of wound that never fully closes, the wound of being unseen by the people who were supposed to see you first. You can build the most extraordinary life on top of it, and it will still be down there, quiet, waiting. Mine waited a very long time. It waited, as it turned out, for a young captain in a hallway who took one look at me and decided I was lost. 36 years after I left home with one duffel bag, I pinned on my 3rd star and took command of a joint special operations task force. I tell you the rank not to impress you, but because it matters for what happened next. There are only a handful of women in the entire history of the United States Army who have worn 3 stars. On the day this story turns, I was one of them, and a captain still told me I was on the wrong floor. The morning it happened, I was not in uniform. I had flown in overnight from Washington, where I had spent 2 days in a closed session of the Senate Armed Services Committee, the kind of meeting where you wear a civilian suit because the last thing anyone wants is a row of uniforms, photographed walking into a secure room. I landed a little after 7, jet-lagged, running on coffee and the particular adrenaline of a first day. My command credentials had not yet been reissued at the new headquarters. My chief of staff, Colonel Yvonne Trapp, was supposed to walk me in, but the badge office flagged a clerical mismatch on my paperwork and she peeled off to fix it, telling me she would catch up. There was a crisis briefing already underway in the Situation Room, and I was the commander it was waiting on. So I went ahead in my civilian blazer with my old building pass, and I climbed the stairs to the operations floor alone. The Situation Room sat behind a heavy door at the end of a short corridor. Standing in front of that door was a young captain, the operations officer's aide, maybe 29 years old, sharp uniform, sharper opinion of himself. His name, I would learn, was Reed Vaughn. He watched me come down the corridor the way a man watches someone he has already decided does not belong. And when I was close enough, he stepped sideways to put himself between me and the door. "Wrong floor, sweetheart," he said, and he smirked. "Visitor center's downstairs, ma'am." I have been called a great many things in 36 years. Sweetheart, on the operations floor of my own command, on my first morning, was a new one. I kept my voice level. "I'm expected inside, Captain. Please step aside." He did not step aside. That was the part that, even now, I find almost impressive. A more careful man would have at least hesitated. Vaughn doubled down, and he did it loudly, loud enough that the watch floor behind the glass could hear every word. "Ma'am, this is a secure briefing. You're lost. Let's not make this a thing, all right? The visitor desk can call whoever you're looking for." The watch officers behind the glass had begun to turn around. I could feel the moment tilting. And I will tell you the truth about what I felt, because it was not what you might expect. I did not feel rage. I felt the floor of my childhood open up under me. I was 54 years old, 3 stars on a uniform I was not wearing, and for one long second I was 18 again at the end of a driveway. Being told by someone who had not bothered to look that I was not who I said I was. And then the heavy door opened. Major General Curtis Aldridge ran the operations center. He was 56, a serious man with 29 years in, and he had opened the door because the briefing could not start without its commander, and he had come to find out where she was. He saw Vaughn first, standing there with his hand half raised toward me. Then he saw my face. I watched it happen in real time. I watched a 2-star general's expression go from mild irritation to recognition to something close to horror in the space of a single breath. He came to attention so fast it was almost violent. And then he said the 4 words that I will hear in my head for the rest of my life, 4 words that did in 1 second what 36 years of letters home had failed to do. "She's your commanding general." The corridor went silent. Not quiet, silent, the kind of silence that has a temperature. Captain Reed Vaughn's face drained of all its color, every bit of it, until he looked like a man who has just understood that the ground he was standing on was never ground at all. His hand dropped to his side. His mouth opened and produced nothing. I had spent my entire life waiting for one person to look at me the way Aldridge was looking at me now, with the simple, total recognition of who I actually was. It turned out to be a stranger in a hallway. There is a lesson in that, and I have turned it over many times since, but in the moment there was no time for lessons. There was a crisis briefing waiting and a room full of people who needed their commander to walk in and be steady. So I did not raise my voice. I did not say a single one of the things a smaller version of me might have said. I looked at the captain, who was now standing rigid against the wall, and I said 2 words. "Carry on." Then I stepped past him, past Aldridge, through the heavy door and into the Situation Room. I took the seat at the head of the table. I set down my coffee, opened the folder waiting at my place, looked up at a room full of officers who had heard every word of what just happened in the hall, and I said, "Good morning. Let's begin. Walk me through the timeline." And we began. I never looked back at the captain. I did not need to. Behind me, through the open door, I could feel him standing there, learning in real time the thing my father never learned in 80 years, that the person you decide is no one, is sometimes the most important person in the building. The briefing ran for 90 minutes. I made 3 decisions in that room that I cannot describe to you, decisions that touched lives. Out in the corridor, a young man stood against a wall and watched the woman he had tried to turn away do the job he had assumed she could not possibly have. My composure was the only punishment I ever gave him. It turned out to be more than enough. The adrenaline of a moment like that does not leave you when the moment ends. It leaves you hours later, all at once, usually when you are finally alone. And what it leaves behind is the truth you were too busy to feel. That night, in unfamiliar quarters, with half my boxes still taped shut, I unpacked the one thing I always unpack first. It is a framed photograph, and it is not a picture of my family. It is a picture of Frank Delacroix pinning my lieutenant's bars onto my collar in 1996. Both of us squinting into bad fluorescent light, both of us younger than I can quite believe. I set it on the desk the way I have set it on every desk I have ever had, and I sat down across from it, and I let the day catch up to me. The captain in the hallway had not really hurt me. That is what I kept coming back to. A stranger's contempt is a small thing, easily survived. What had hurt was the echo. For 1 second in that corridor, I had been standing at the end of the driveway again, and the man telling me I was lost had my father's certainty in his voice. That complete, casual confidence that he had me figured out and that I was less than I claimed. I had felt the old wound open, clean and quick, and it had startled me how close to the surface it still lived after all these years and all these stars. Colonel Yvonne Trapp found me the next morning with 2 cups of coffee and the news that the whole command already knew. Yvonne is 48, blunt as a hammer, and one of maybe 4 people on earth I trust completely. She set the coffee down and told me the watch floor had been retelling the hallway story all night. "Half of them think you handled it like a saint," she said. "The other half wish you'd buried the kid in paperwork so deep his grandchildren would still be digging." I asked her which half she was in. She thought about it honestly, which is one of the reasons I trust her, and said, "I'm in the half that's wondering why it didn't seem to surprise you." That stopped me, because she was right. I had not been surprised. Insulted, yes. Wounded in that old place, yes, but not surprised, and a leader should ask herself why a thing like that fails to surprise her. So I told Yvonne the truth, more of it than I usually tell anyone. I told her that the captain in the hallway was not the first person to take one look at me and decide I was no one. I told her he was just the latest in a line that started at a dinner table in Ohio and ran the whole length of my life. I told her that the person I had truly been waiting my whole career to be recognized by was not a stranger at all, and that he had been dead for 2 years, and that he had been my father. Yvonne did not offer me comfort because she knew I did not want it. She just listened, which was the right thing, and when I was done, she said, "Well, for what it's worth, the woman who walked into that room and ran the briefing didn't look like she was waiting on anybody's permission." I thought about my father's funeral in the spring of 2024. I had flown home and stood at the back of the church in my dress uniform, 2 stars at the time, and a cousin I had not seen in years had leaned over and whispered, kindly, trying to make conversation, "Now, are you the one in the National Guard or something like that?" I had said yes. It was simpler. My father was in a casket 20 feet away, and even then, the family's picture of me had outlived the man who drew it. He had died without ever once saying the word proud in a sentence that had me in it. I had made my peace with that, or I had told myself the sentence so many times that it had started to sound true. Sitting there with Yvonne and the cold dregs of the coffee, I understood something I had been avoiding for a long time. I had spent 36 years quietly hoping that if I just rose high enough, the height would finally be visible from that house. 3 stars, a command, a seat in a closed session of the Senate, and a captain in a hallway could still wipe all of it away in one sentence and leave me feeling like a girl at the end of a driveway. Which meant the height had never been the point. The height was never going to fix it, because the thing that was broken was never on my end. So I made a decision that morning, sitting in a half-unpacked office with a photograph of the one man who ever drove 4 hours to watch me succeed. The decision was quiet. There was no speech in it, not even to myself. I decided I was done. Done managing other people's comfort with who I was. Done shrinking the truth so it would fit inside someone else's small picture of me. Done waiting for a permission slip that the people I was waiting on had never had the capacity to sign. Not loudly. I want to be clear about that because the channel of my whole life has never been the loud one. I did not declare anything. I did not call anyone to announce a new era. I simply set down a weight I had been carrying so long I had stopped noticing the ache of it. And I noticed, the moment I set it down, how much lighter I stood. The question that remained was what kind of leader the hallway moment would make me. A smaller person would have used it to take something. I had a captain at my mercy and a lifetime of being underestimated pushing me to make an example of him. I could have ended Reed Vaughn's career with a phone call and felt, for about an hour, like I had finally won something. I sat with that temptation, honestly. And then I thought about a 19-year-old private in a supply tent in the desert, the one everyone had assumed was lost too. And the captain who had walked in and asked her where she learned to think instead of asking her what she thought she was doing there. And I knew exactly what kind of leader I wanted to be. Major General Aldridge came to my office 2 days later, and he came expecting blood. I do not blame him for the expectation. In his place, I might have expected the same. A captain had publicly humiliated a brand new 3-star commander on her first morning in front of the watch floor. And the ordinary arc of that story ends with the captain relieved of his post, a permanent flag in his file, and a career that quietly stops climbing. Aldridge arrived with the paperwork already half-drafted in his head. I could see it in the set of his shoulders. He was ready to be the instrument of my justice. I told him no. He blinked. "Ma'am? I'm not relieving Captain Vaughn," I said. "I'm not flagging him. I want him kept exactly where he is." Aldridge was quiet for a moment, doing the arithmetic of a senior officer trying to figure out whether his new commander was weak, naive, or playing a longer game he could not yet see. So I told him the part that mattered. "I was a private once," I said, "in a supply tent in 1991, with everyone around me assuming I was lost too. The only reason I'm sitting in this chair is that a man named Frank Delacroix decided to build me instead of break me. I would rather build the captain than break him. Breaking him costs me nothing and teaches him nothing. Building him is harder. We're going to do the hard thing." Something shifted in Aldridge's face. The wariness went out of it and was replaced by something I had not expected to earn that quickly, which was respect. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And then, after a beat, "Delacroix? Frank Delacroix, the group commander out of the late 90s?" I said yes. Aldridge nodded slowly. "I served under him once. He'd have liked the way you just handled that." I had Captain Vaughn brought to my office that afternoon. He came in like a man walking to his own execution, pale and rigid, and he stood at attention so hard he was practically vibrating. He had clearly spent 2 days imagining every version of the end of his career. I did not give him the end of his career. I gave him something he found, I think, far more uncomfortable. I gave him the truth, plainly, with no cruelty in it, which left him nowhere to hide. I told him exactly what he had done wrong. Not the rudeness, though we covered that. The deeper thing. I told him he had looked at a person and decided who she was before he had a single fact, and that an officer who does that at a door will eventually do it in a place where it gets people killed. I told him the uniform does not give you the authority to decide who belongs. It gives you the duty to find out. And then, instead of removing him, I assigned him to brief me personally every morning for 30 days. Operation summary, 0700 hours, my office, just the two of us and whatever he had failed to prepare. He had expected to be exiled. Instead, he was going to spend a month standing in front of the exact person he had insulted, accountable to her face every single day. I have never seen relief and dread fight so hard for the same square inch of a young man's expression. "That's all, Captain," I said. "I'll see you at 0700. The harder conversation, the one that cost me more, happened on the phone that evening with my brother. Wesley had heard a version of the story. He works in corporate law, and one of his clients does defense contracting. And somewhere in that orbit, a garbled rumor had reached him that his sister had been involved in some kind of scene at a military headquarters. He called, and I could hear the old reflex in his voice before he even got the words out, the reflex our father had installed in him 40 years earlier. "Come on, Suze," he said with that easy, affectionate condescension that had narrated my entire life. "A general, somebody told me you're running some big command now. You always did like to make the army stuff sound bigger than it is, There was a time that sentence would have made me argue. I would have marshaled the evidence, laid out the facts, tried to make him see, and he would have nodded and changed the subject, and nothing would have changed. I had played that game for 30 years, and it had never once worked, because the problem was never a shortage of evidence. The problem was that he had decided long ago who I was allowed to be. So I did not argue. I told him the truth, once, calmly. "I'm a Lieutenant General, Wesley. I command a Joint Special Operations Task Force. I'm not exaggerating, and I'm not going to keep explaining it. You can believe me or not. That's up to you now." And then I let it sit. I did not fill the silence. For the first time in our lives, I handed my brother the truth and refused to also carry the burden of making him accept it. The silence on the line stretched out, uncomfortable, and I let it stay uncomfortable. It was not my job anymore to make the truth easy for him to swallow. He muttered something about needing to go, and we hung up. My mother called an hour later, anxious, her voice thin. Wesley had clearly phoned her. "Susie," she said, "are you in some kind of trouble at work?" Wesley said there was an incident. That was the word she reached for. Incident. As though the only way her daughter could end up at the center of a story at a military command was by doing something wrong. Even now, after everything, the family imagination could not stretch far enough to picture me as the authority in the room. The most they could conceive was that I had gotten myself into trouble. I told my mother I was fine. I told her I was not in any trouble. I did not try to explain the rest because I had finally learned that some doors you can only hold open. You cannot make a person walk through them. I hung up the phone on a family that still could not picture me at the head of any table, and I went to bed, and I slept better than I had in years. The thing about making a young man brief you every morning at 0700 hours is that you find out very quickly what he is actually made of. The first week, Captain Vaughn was terrible. Not unprepared, he was too frightened to be unprepared, but stiff, defensive, reciting facts at me like a man reading his own sentencing. He flinched when I asked questions. He apologized for things that did not require an apology. I let him be uncomfortable, because comfort was not the point, but I never once raised my voice. And slowly, over days, he began to understand that the daily briefing was not a punishment designed to humiliate him. It was an expectation. I expected him to be good. That, more than any reprimand, seemed to rearrange something in him. By the second week, he stopped flinching. By the third week, something genuine had started to happen. He began to anticipate my questions. He would walk in with the summary and also with the 3 follow-ups he knew I would ask, already answered. He started catching things, a discrepancy in a logistics report, a gap in a timeline, the kind of small, careful noticing that cannot be faked and cannot be ordered, only grown. I watched a smug gatekeeper turn, day by day, into the early outline of a real officer. One morning near the end of the month, after the summary was done, he stood there a moment longer than usual and asked me the question I had been waiting for him to find the courage to ask. "Ma'am, permission to ask why you didn't just end me. After the hallway. You could have. Everyone says you could have." I considered how much to tell him and decided he had earned the real answer. "Because someone once didn't end me," I said. "I was about your age, and I had done nothing to deserve a second chance except be willing to use one. A man chose to build me instead of break me. Everything I am, I owe in part to that choice." You don't repay a debt like that by breaking the next person who's standing where you used to stand. You repay it by building them. That's the whole job, Captain, the mission, and the people. Don't ever let anyone tell you it's only one of those. He was quiet. Then he said, "I'd like to be the kind of officer who deserved that, ma'am." And I believed him. There was one morning in particular that I keep. He came in with a logistics summary that looked clean, and then he stopped halfway through and said he wanted to flag something that was probably nothing. A fuel allocation did not match a movement order by a margin small enough that 19 out of 20 officers would have let it slide. He had not let it slide. He had chased it down the night before and found a transposed figure that, left alone, would have stranded a team without resupply at exactly the wrong hour. It was the kind of catch that does not show up in any citation and saves people anyway. I told him so. I watched him understand, maybe for the first time, that the careful, unglamorous noticing he had just done was the actual substance of the work, and that the swagger he had carried in the hallway had never been the substance of anything. While the captain was being remade in my office, my brother was being unmade in his. I did not see it happen, but I heard about it later, in pieces, and I have assembled it the way I assemble everything, from the available evidence. Wesley, after our phone call, did what lawyers do when something nags at them. He went looking for facts. He could not bear the small possibility that he had been wrong, so he set out, I think, to prove himself right. He searched my name. He found my command's public citations. He found a redacted award narrative with most of the verbs blacked out, but enough left visible to make the shape of what was missing unmistakable. He found a photograph from a change of command, his sister in dress uniform with 3 silver stars on each shoulder, being saluted by a row of men. He told me, much later, that he sat at his desk and looked at that photograph for a long time. He said the thing that undid him was not the stars. It was the date on one of the citations. It was from a year he remembered clearly because it was the year he had told a dinner table full of his friends that his sister had some administrative thing with the army, and everyone had laughed gently, the way you laugh at a family's lovable underachiever. He had been making that joke, he realized, in the same season I had been making decisions he was not cleared to know the first thing about. The next time we spoke, my brother had no joke ready. It was the first time in our adult lives that the silence on the phone was coming from his end. He started to say something twice and stopped both times. Finally, he just said my name, Susie. And then nothing, and the nothing said more than any apology could have. A man who has built his whole sense of himself partly on being bigger than his sister does not find words quickly when the floor of that gives way. I did not rush to fill his silence either. I had spent a lifetime making things easy for that family. I was done doing that. But I will tell you, there was no triumph in it for me. I had imagined, in my worst and smallest moments over the years, that being finally proven right would feel like victory. It did not. It felt like watching someone discover, far too late, a room in their own house they had walked past for 40 years and never opened. What I felt, watching the captain grow and my brother go quiet, was something I had not expected and did not have a name for at first. It took me a few days to recognize it. It was the absence of need. For the first time, I did not need the captain to respect me, though he was coming to. I did not need my brother to finally see me, though he finally was. The recognition I had chased my whole life was arriving from every direction at once, and I noticed, almost with surprise, that I no longer required any of it. Somewhere in the half-unpacked office, with Frank's photograph on the desk, I had stopped waiting. And a person who has stopped waiting is a very hard person to keep small. Wesley flew out to see me in the early summer. It was the first time in our entire lives that my brother had ever traveled to where I was. I had flown to him for graduations, for the births of his children, for the housewarming at the home our father had been so proud of. He had never once made the trip in the other direction. That he made it now told me more than anything he could have said at the door. He arrived defensive, which I understood. Apology does not come naturally to people who were raised to believe they had nothing to apologize for. He started with the careful, lawyerly version, the one with the soft edges. He said he supposed he had not always given my career its proper due. He said things had gotten busy over the years. He said the family had its dynamics, and we were all products of them. I let him get through it. And then I told him, gently but without letting him off the hook, that the soft version was not going to be enough, because the soft version was just another way of not quite looking at the thing. So he tried again. And the second time he found the truth, and it was hard to watch, and harder, I think, for him to say. I made you smaller, he said, so I could feel bigger. Dad taught me how to do it, and I was good at it, and the worst part is I kept doing it long after he was gone. I didn't even need him in the room anymore. I'd just do it on my own. I made a whole personality out of being the one who turned out right, and the only way that worked was if you were the one who turned out wrong. And you never were. You were never wrong, Susie. I just needed you to be. I did not say it was all right, because it was not. And one of the things I had finally learned was to stop saying things were all right when they were not. Instead, I told him the truest thing I had. You don't get 30 years back with one weekend, I said. I'm not going to pretend you do. But you can start showing up. That's all anybody ever has to do. Frank Delacroix taught me that. You just have to be one of the people who shows up. The rest you earn slowly, the same way everybody earns everything. He asked what showing up looked like. I told him. Honesty first. No more jokes at my expense, not even the affectionate ones, because the affectionate ones had done as much damage as the cruel ones. Maybe more, because they were harder to object to. Presence, second. Call because you want to know how I am, not because Mom told you to. And the third thing, I said, was simply to believe me the first time. To extend to me the same baseline credence he extended to every stranger, the assumption that I knew my own life better than he did. He agreed to all of it. Whether he could do it was another question, but he agreed, and he meant it in the moment, and sometimes meaning it in the moment is where everything real starts. I took him onto the installation the next day, the public areas only, the places a civilian brother is allowed to see. And I watched something happen to him that no photograph and no citation could have produced. He watched soldiers come to attention when I passed. He watched a full colonel call me ma'am and wait for me to go first through a door. He watched the small, constant choreography of deference that surrounds a 3-star officer, and he saw, for the first time with his own eyes, that it was real, that it was not a story I told to make the army stuff sound bigger than it was. It was simply my life, the ordinary texture of a life he had spent 40 years refusing to picture. There was a moment, standing outside the headquarters building, when a sergeant first class he did not know stopped, came to attention, and said, "Good afternoon, ma'am," and waited for me to acknowledge him before he moved on. It was nothing. It happens to me 40 times a day, and I barely register it anymore. But I saw Wesley register it. I saw him watch a grown man who had never met me treat me with a respect that my brother had spent 4 decades refusing to extend, and I saw the math of it land on his face. A stranger in a uniform had granted me, on sight, the dignity my own family had withheld my whole life. He was very quiet on the drive back. At one point he said, almost to himself, "All this time." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The last piece came on the phone, a week after Wesley flew home. My mother called, and I could tell from the first syllable that Wesley had spoken to her, had told her what he had seen, had perhaps said to her some version of what he had said to me. There was a long preamble, the way there always was with my mother, the weather and the neighbors and Wesley's children. And then, near the end, In a small voice, she said the words I had waited my entire life to hear from anyone in that house. She said she was proud of me. I want to tell you that it healed everything. It did not. I had built a self that no longer required those words, which is the only reason I could receive them without bitterness. They came 54 years late, from a woman who had watched in silence while it mattered most, and I took them for exactly what they were, which was a small, true, insufficient gift, offered at last by someone learning very late how to give it. I said, "Thank you, Mom." I meant it. And I did not pretend it erased a single empty seat or a single empty driveway. It did not have to. I had already stopped needing it to. By the end of the summer, the hallway had become a story the command told itself, the way every command keeps a small, private mythology. New arrivals heard it within their first week. The version that circulated was kind to me and instructive about the captain, and somewhere in the retelling, it had stopped being about my humiliation and become about the standard I had set when I chose to teach instead of destroy. I did not mind that the story lived on. A command needs stories about what its leaders do with power when no one would have blamed them for misusing it. Captain Reed Vaughn finished his 30 days of morning briefings and kept coming for a few more, out of what I can only describe as habit, until I told him, kindly, that he had graduated. Not long after, a real operational assignment opened up, the kind that is a genuine opportunity for an officer on the rise, and I made sure his name was in the conversation, on the merits, because by then he had earned it on the merits. The morning before he transferred, he came to my office one last time, and this time he did not stand rigid against the possibility of his own destruction. He stood at ease like an officer who knew his worth. He thanked me properly, not for sparing him, though he was grateful for that. He thanked me for the standard. I almost turned away the most important person in the building because I'd already decided who she was, he said. I think about that every time I'm at a door now. Any door. I'm never going to be the guy who does that again, ma'am. I wanted you to know it took. I told him I knew it had taken. I had watched it take, morning by morning, at 0700 hours. And I told him to go be the kind of officer who walks lost people to the right room instead of turning them away from it, and he said, "Yes, ma'am." And he went, and I never had a single doubt that he would. There was one more loop I needed to close, and it was the oldest one. Frank Delacroix died in 2018. He had retired a full colonel, and he had stayed in my life until the end, the closest thing to a father I ever had. The man who drove 4 hours to pin my bars when the people who should have come stayed home. I had not been able to get to his funeral. I was deployed, doing work I could not leave, which he, of all people, would have understood completely. I had carried that absence quietly ever since. So one afternoon in the late summer, I drove out to where he is buried, and I stood at the grave in the slanting light, and I told him everything. I told him about the hallway and the 4 words, and the captain who went white. I told him about the boy I had built instead of broken, because he had once built me instead of breaking me, and how the debt felt, at last, a little more paid. I told him about Wesley flying out and my mother on the phone and the words that came 54 years late. I told him about the photograph of him on my desk that has outlasted 3 commands and a marriage and most of the people in it. And I told him the thing I had figured out, standing in that corridor with a 2-star general at attention and a captain going pale and a lifetime collapsing into a single second. I told him that for 36 years I had thought the wound was about not being seen, but standing in the hallway, finally and completely seen by a stranger, I had felt the old ache anyway, and that was the clue I had been missing my whole life. The wound was never about whether they saw me. The wound was that I had been waiting for their seeing to be the thing that made me real. I had handed the question of my own worth to people who had proven, again and again, that they could not be trusted to answer it. The captain in the hallway, the empty seats at graduation, my father's certainty, even my mother's late and gentle pride, none of it had ever had the power I gave it. The only person who had ever been able to answer the question of whether I belonged was me, and I had spent half a century waiting for the answer to arrive from anyone else. I told him, too, about the small things, because Frank had always cared about the small things more than the large ones. I told him that the captain had learned to catch a transposed figure in a fuel report at midnight. I told him that my brother had learned to say the word sister and the word general in the same sentence without flinching. I told him that my mother, at 78, had finally found a word she had been unable to locate for 54 years, and that I had taken it from her gently and without making her pay for how late it came. Frank would have understood all of it. He had spent his whole career believing that the measure of a leader was not the medals on the chest, but the people left standing taller in the wake of the work. By that measure, I told him, I thought I had finally done something he would have been proud of. I stood there a long time. The light went gold and then gray, and I asked the dead the only question that still mattered, which was not whether I had finally been seen, because I had, by the command, by the captain, even by my brother. The question was simpler and harder. Now that the seeing had come, would I let the old wound keep telling me what I was worth? Or would I finally take the answer back into my own hands, where it had belonged the entire time? I think Frank already knew my answer. He had known it in a supply tent in 1991 when he looked at a private everyone had written off and asked her where she learned to think. He had been telling me the answer my whole life. It just took me until a graveside at dusk, 54 years old, with 3 stars and a long road behind me, to finally believe the man who had believed in me first. Months later, there was a family gathering, and for the first time in my life, I went to one entirely on my own terms. I wore civilian clothes, the same kind I had been wearing the morning the captain told me I was on the wrong floor, and I noticed walking in that the clothes meant something completely different to me now. They were no longer a disguise I wore, so my family could keep me small. They were just clothes. I did not need anyone in that room to know about the stars. The stars were not the point, and had never been the point. I knew who I was, and I had finally stopped requiring the room to confirm it. The gathering was imperfect, the way families are. There were old patterns that surfaced, and old silences that did not entirely heal. But there were new things too. My mother, older and softer now, held my hand a moment longer than she used to. And Wesley, my brother, did something small that I will remember for the rest of my life. He introduced me to a friend of his, a man I had never met, and he did it accurately, and he did it proudly. He said, "This is my sister. She's a lieutenant general in the Army. She commands a special operations task force." No joke, no diminishment, no affectionate little laugh to cut me down to a size he could carry. Just the truth, offered plainly, with something in his voice that I realized, after a second, was pride. He had learned how to say it. It had taken him 40 years, but he had learned. I caught his eye across the room afterward, and we did not say anything, because we did not need to. Some things are better left in the look. Back at the command, life went on the way command life goes on, full and demanding and deeply mine. The hallway story had softened into something I could even smile about. And one ordinary afternoon, walking the operations floor, I passed a young soldier standing in a corridor with the particular frozen look of a person who is completely lost and afraid to admit it. She was holding a folder and checking a door number against a slip of paper and getting it wrong. I stopped. I asked her if she needed help finding something. She told me the room she was looking for, embarrassed, certain she was bothering someone important. And I walked her there myself. 2 corridors and a flight of stairs. I did not have to. There were a dozen people who could have pointed the way. But I walked her there myself, all the way to the right door, because I had stood at a door once and been turned away by someone who decided who I was before he knew the first true thing about me. And I had promised myself, somewhere along this whole long road, that I would be the opposite of that man for the rest of my life. She thanked me, still not knowing who I was, and went in, and I stood in the corridor for a moment afterward and felt something close all the way that had been open for 54 years. I thought about Captain Vaughn out at his new assignment, almost certainly walking some other lost soul to some other door. The lesson passed along the way Frank had passed it to me, and I had passed it to him. That is how it is supposed to work. You do not get to keep the good that was done to you. You are only allowed to keep it by giving it away, and the giving is the only thing that ever makes the original gift mean anything. A man built me when he could have broken me. I built a captain when I could have broken him. The captain will build someone else. None of us will ever be able to repay the people who started it, and that is exactly the point. You pay it forward, down the line, to people you will never meet, at doors you will never see. I want to say one thing to you, whoever you are, wherever you are tuning in from tonight. There is a difference between being recognized and recognizing yourself, and almost everyone learns it too late, if they learn it at all. Being recognized feels wonderful. I will not pretend it does not. The day a stranger in a hallway finally saw exactly who I was, after a lifetime of people who would not, I felt something I had waited half a century to feel. But here is what no one tells you. That feeling came from him, and anything that comes from someone else can be taken back by someone else. A father can withhold it. A brother can mock it. A captain can wave it off at a door. If your sense of your own worth lives in other people's eyes, then other people will always hold the key to a room you should have owned outright. The other kind, the recognizing yourself, no one can ever take that back. It does not feel as electric as a stranger snapping to attention. It feels quieter than that. It feels like peace. It feels like walking into a room you used to dread and noticing, halfway through, that you simply do not need anything from anyone in it. It feels like being able to give recognition away freely to a chastened captain, to a lost young soldier in a corridor, because you are no longer starving for it yourself. I spent 36 years waiting to be seen by people who had decided not to look. And the thing I finally understood, standing at a graveside and standing at a doorway and standing in my own life at last, was that the one person who had been refusing to look the whole time was me. I had been waiting for them to tell me I belonged, when belonging was never theirs to grant. So if you have ever stood at the end of a driveway with one bag, waiting for someone who was never going to come, I want you to hear this from someone who waited longer than she should have. You do not need them to come. You never did. Walk yourself to the right door. You have always known where it is. If you've ever waited your whole life for someone to finally see you and slowly realize the only person who could answer the question of your worth was you, then this story was really about you too. And I'd love to hear it. Tell me in the comments. Have you ever been turned away at a door by someone who decided who you were on sight? Did you ever get the moment where the truth finally landed in front of the people who doubted you, and did it feel the way you thought it would? And if you've ever had to stop waiting for permission and walk yourself to the right door, I want to hear how that went for you. If this one hit home, take a second to subscribe before you go. It means more than you know, and I read every story you leave me.